In the summer of 1864, a beautiful 19-year-old woman, Fanny Kelly, was captured by Indians. While traveling on the frontier for lands in Idaho, her wagon train was ambushed by the Lakota. The men were massacred. The women and children were taken. For the next 6 months, Fanny lived with them, amid a hostile wilderness and constant threat of death she endured. Her courage and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds would lead her to pen one of the most vivid and gripping accounts of frontier survival ever written. This is her story of what it was like to be kidnapped by the Lakota. Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. But before we get to our story, I research historical topics I find interesting and tell them the way that I would to my friends. If you like that kind of thing, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And if you really like it, take a look at my Patreon. The link is in the description. But let's get back to our story. In May of 1864, a small train of wagons set out along the Oregon Trail. Fanny, only 19, had just gotten married to Josiah Kelly. Josiah had been a farmer and discharged Union soldier, and despite being 15 years her senior, he was quickly smitten by Fanny's beauty and charm. Josiah's time farming and at war had taken a toll on his health, and the family set their sights on the golden hills of Idaho along the Oregon Trail, hoping that the climate would help him recover. Joining them was their adopted daughter, 7-year-old Mary, recently orphaned by the death of her parents, one of whom was Fanny's sister. She connected with her niece and grew to love and adore her. With distinctive fair hair, Mary was sweet and innocent. Fanny desired to protect her at all costs. The wagon train was small. It had less than a dozen people. It included the Kellys' 2 black servants, Frank and Andy. Others in the party included Kelly's neighbor, a minister, and the Larimore family, consisting of William and Sarah Larimore, as well as their 8-year-old son. Although they were heading far past the safety of the eastern settlements, the party didn't fear attack from Indians. That is, all except for Mary. She had seen Native Americans at the trading posts, and despite reassurances from her adoptive father, she always felt like they looked at her strangely, like their smiles were fake, and in different circumstances, they would fade, and the Indians would reveal their true intentions. The stories heard by white children in the 1860s would have made Native Americans feel like boogeymen or monsters, the things in the dark that give children nightmares. Painted men in feathered headdresses that would raid wagon trains and kill the peaceful travelers. That fear was partly justified. The party knew the land they were traveling into was home to the Lakota, a large, powerful tribe made up of many bands of mobile warriors who moved around on horseback. Fanny assured Mary that they were safe. Ranches and outposts, as well as soldiers at nearby Fort Laramie, protected settlers. Most of all, there were agreements with natives in place, so they should be allowed unmolested through the territory. On July 12th, the party crossed Little Box Elder Creek, and an optimistic, warm orange poured over the vast plains of the Black Hills. In the evening, they sang Ho for Idaho, together under the beautiful setting sun. But then they saw them. Hundreds of painted warriors, mounted and equipped for war. The singing ended. At first, the Lakota didn't move. In full view of the wagon train, they just sat atop a bluff, mounted on their horses. Fanny estimated that there must have been 200 warriors. The war party then slowly descended. Josiah, taking the lead, immediately commanded the wagons into a defensive ring and encouraged the few men to prepare arms. The Lakota halted, a safe distance from their perimeter. There they lingered, menacingly whooping and firing guns into the air, but not engaging the pioneers. Fanny's mind focused solely on the shaking and terrified Mary. With the child wrapped in her arms, Fanny begged her husband not to do anything that would provoke the Indians, telling him that, if you fire one shot, they will massacre all of us. Her advice encouraged her husband to hold fire. Josiah, a veteran, hated doing nothing, but his wife was right. With their overwhelming numbers, their lives were in the hands of the Lakota. After several minutes, the war cries and gunfire ceased. As near silence hovered over the prairie, a single warrior approached the wagon circle. Josiah left Fanny to meet the warrior. He was an elder and a chief named Ottawa. Ottawa revealed to Josiah that he was in Oglala, the same band of Sitting Bull, Red Cloud, and Crazy Horse. The chief used his limited English to communicate. Good Indian me. He beat his chest and pointed to those around him as he insisted on their benevolence. He said that their party wasn't meant for war, but rather they had stumbled upon the wagons while on a hunt for buffalo and deer. Fanny, still gripping Mary, felt momentary relief as Josiah shook Ottawa's hand. But it was then that the rest of the warriors quickly pushed forward into the ring. The 200-warrior party completely enveloped the small wagon train. Despite their smiles, handshakes, and nods, Fanny could tell that Mary knew something was very wrong. She looked at Fanny, the way that she had when she saw Indians at the trading posts. As the natives moved among the travelers, their eyes scanned the wagon circle. The only way that Fanny and Josiah could interpret it is that they were looking for threats and valuables. Chief Ottawa insisted that they should trade, and Josiah, desperate to keep the peace, willingly agreed. But the Indians began to brazenly seize more and more. Josiah did everything he could to appease them. He even traded his favorite horse. Josiah's submissiveness to the Indians was an effort to stall. Delaying the constantly traveled trail increased the possibility of help. The arrival of even a small convoy would scare the Lakota away, who preferred only engaging when they had an advantage. Eventually, their request for so-called trade went too far, when one of the Indians reached for Josiah's gun. He pulled the gun away, telling the Indian no. Then he began to take a more aggressive posture, confirming for him what he already knew. They were not truly here in peace. Just as immediate conflict seemed certain, Ottawa stepped in. He told the pioneers to continue down the trail, that trading was done. Wearily, Josiah, Fanny, Mary, and the rest of the party organized the wagons and continued steadily down the trail. However, the Lakota followed them closely, with some warriors still among the wagons. Shortly later, the party approached a valley surrounded by rocks. Josiah stopped the wagons. A narrow location like this was perfect for an ambush. His intuition told him that that's why the Indians were pushing him here. Despite the Lakota's insistence to proceed, Josiah refused. Conflict for a second time seemed certain, until tension was again eased when the natives requested instead that they share a meal before departing into the hills. Eager to keep them peaceful, the party began preparing the provisions for the meal. Josiah and one of the servants, Andy, wearily went to collect firewood in the forest. The others in the party spread out to gather what else they had. In their hurry, they didn't realize that they had become isolated and vulnerable. Fanny describes what happened next. Then suddenly, our terrible enemies threw off their masks and displayed their true natures. The Lakota set upon the pioneers. With the crack of a gunshot, one of the travelers' heads jerked back and his body collapsed, dead. Chaos ensued amidst the wagon train, as the arrows and bullets joined the war cries of the Lakota. One of the black servants, Frank, rushed to aid Fanny, but he tumbled dead at her feet, his body pierced by several arrows. The Lakota had made short work of the few men, and quickly turned their attention to the wagons. Hearing the cacophony of gunshots and screams, Josiah and Andy ran until they could see the wagon train. Smoke from gunpowder filled the air. Carnage and chaos unfolded before them. Unable to clearly see, Josiah assumed it was too late. Even if his wife and adopted daughter were alive, he and Andy were no match for an entire war party. For Indian captives, mercy could be shown to women and children, but almost never men. This was known. Without anyone left to resist them, the warriors jumped into the wagons and began looting. Their tomahawks, some still dripping with blood, smashed open chests to reveal heirlooms that had been in families for generations. The Indians even emptied bags of flour into the dirt, so that they could make off with even more plunder. Fanny clutched Mary, standing there, still as possible. She prayed that doing so would prolong their lives. Perhaps, if they weren't a threat, the Lakota would take what they wanted and simply leave. They weren't ignored for long. When Fanny noticed warriors looking at them, she ran to the chief, Ottawa, and begged for his protection. He seemed indifferent, and told her to be quiet, resting his hand on his revolver to send a clear message. She left him, but now the warriors stayed near. With her eyes, she frantically scoured the trees for signs of her husband, but she never saw him. The Lakota brought Sarah Larimore and her son to join Fanny and Mary. Sarah's husband had fled at the start of the attack. Sarah was distraught. Fanny tried to calm her down, but Sarah's weeping turned to wailing when she saw the Indians set upon her family's wagon. Tired of hearing the woman scream, Ottawa walked up to her with a knife and pointed the blade directly at her. He insisted on her silence. This she understood, and the screaming stopped. Fanny took the moment again to plead with Ottawa for her life and protection. He hesitated, stoic and quiet as the rampage continued around them. But then he placed a wreath of feathers on her head. Something Fanny would learn later was a token of his protection. Fanny and Mary clung to each other as the Indians finished their raid. The men with them had either all been murdered or fled. Their wagons and valuables were either taken or destroyed. They were now prisoners to the Lakota. Leaving the corpses and wreckage, Fanny and the other prisoners were forced on the backs of horses. They were made to ride along with the Lakota. Fanny and Mary were on one horse, and Mrs. Larimore and her son were on another. Within a few hours, though, the two families were separated. Fanny maintained some of her possessions: a nice pair of shoes, a few sets of clothes, and over $100 in paper money that was in her pockets, as well as a couple books and letters. Unlike Mrs. Larimore, Fanny still had faith in her husband, certain that he would follow their trail and get them help. Fanny discreetly ripped out the pages of her books, leaving them behind, like breadcrumbs. The Lakota continued north into the night, a common practice following a raid. War parties didn't stick around to enjoy their work when they knew that odds could shift quickly. A well-executed raid hit hard and fast, without any casualties of their own. Despite the heat of the day, the night was dark and cool. Fanny noticed glittering stars overhead and a dark forest all around them. But it wasn't quiet. The warriors chanted war songs as the party moved across creeks and dangerous gorges. Although the Indians rode near, the darkness often hid mother and child. Fanny knew that they would quickly see if she dismounted, but perhaps they wouldn't notice a small child. Whispering, Fanny said, "Mary, we are only a few miles from our camp. I have dropped letters on the way. These papers will guide you back again. Drop gently down and lie on the ground for a little while to avoid being seen. Then retrace your steps. If I can, I will follow you." With that, she threw her shawl around the child to help her in the chilly night. Mary's face clearly showed fear and reluctance to leave. Fanny brushed her hands through Mary's fair hair, her trembling lips mouthing a prayer. When the Lakota riders drifted a little further away, Fanny dropped her 7-year-old adopted daughter to the ground, who quickly hid in the brush. The warriors didn't seem to notice, and they kept moving down the trail. Mary was free, but Fanny's own escape wasn't as successful. Over the course of the next hour, she searched in desperation for her own chance to drop from the horse. She felt that the further that they rode, the more diminished her chances would be for rescue. In the darkness, she made a clumsy attempt at dismounting. The Lakota were not fooled, and they were immediately upon her. But then they also noticed that Mary was gone. They beat Fanny, and they demanded to know where the child was. She lied. She tried to explain that she wasn't trying to escape. She said that Mary had fallen asleep and slipped off the horse, and that she had only jumped down in an attempt to find her. Clearly not believing her, the beatings continued. They told her that any further attempts to escape would only be met with harsher punishment, but that they would try to find Mary in the morning. After a few more hours, the war party stopped to camp for the night, finally far enough away that they felt safe. All night long, Fanny was closely guarded by warriors holding tomahawks. In the morning, as they had said, the Indians were sent out to find Mary, but Fanny never got word that they did. She prayed that she would have been able to follow the book pages and find help, but it killed her, not knowing what happened to her. At least she was reunited with Sarah Larimore and her son. As the journey continued, now on foot, Chief Ottawa approached them, and clearly preferring her to Sarah, he asked Fanny to carry his belongings. They included a bow and gun, as well as a 3-foot stick that Fanny couldn't identify. The items were heavy, but Fanny dared not to stop as they traveled. She constantly searched the trees with her eyes. The wind sounded to her like Mary was calling out to her. It's something that she couldn't get out of her head. The thought of her daughter distracted her, and she dropped Ottawa's stick. It broke in two. Fanny quickly looked around, but none of the Lakota had noticed. Rather than stop, she kicked it off the side of the trail and continued to move with her captors. That day, they halted in a valley close to Deer Creek Station in Wyoming. They stopped there for the rest of the day, and the Indians used heavy straps to tie Fanny down. Fanny immediately fought at the straps when the Lakota weren't looking, but Sarah was terrified to be alone, begging Fanny not to leave her if she did get free. Determined, Fanny wouldn't make that promise. The only thing she could think of was finding Mary and her husband. But exhausted, she finally fell asleep. In the morning, she woke. Sarah and her son were gone. In the middle of the night, an Indian had helped them to escape, but left Fanny tied down. She was now all alone. Fanny continued to act as a porter for Ottawa's possessions, as the Lakota journeyed further away from white civilization. The warriors dug for water in a creek bed, but when little was found, Fanny was forced to go without. She was so thirsty, but she marched along as best she could, struggling to keep up over the barren terrain. As night fell, after yet another day of travel, the Lakota made a big fire and began to dance around it. This was different than the other camps. The whooping and chanting made Fanny fear what they had brought her here to do. Suddenly, Ottawa stopped the dancing, turned to Fanny, and yelled, "Chapa Chinapa." Everyone just stared at her. But Fanny didn't know what he meant. He said it again, this time more aggressively. "Chapa Chinapa." An Indian boy named Wachella approached her, making a puffing motion with his lips. She then understood. Ottawa wanted his pipe. Fanny considered what she had been carrying, but couldn't recall a pipe. Her eyes widened. It must have been that 3-foot stick that she had dropped and broke. When Ottawa realized that Fanny had lost his pipe, he became furious and declared that Fanny should die for such a sin. He ordered her to be tied to a horse and to be dragged past warriors for target practice. Fanny shook as she watched the warriors knock their bows and a horse was brought forward. They placed firebrands and hot coals, anticipating the encouragement needed to make the horse run. One Indian was sent to retrieve a fast mount. Fanny kneeled and again prayed, thinking of Mary and her husband. As Ottawa approached, rope in hand, her hands frantically searched for something to make up for what she had done. Her small books were useless, maybe her shoes, but then she remembered the money in her pockets. In a frenzy, she pulled out the banknotes and essentially threw them upon Ottawa and the other nearby Indians. She fanned out the remaining bills, passing out $120 in total, insisting upon their high value. Either impressed by the money or her frantic pleas, this amused Ottawa, and he had the warriors place their weapons on the ground. Fanny wrote that in her relief, she literally fainted. When she awoke, she was guarded, but the weapons, horse, and gauntlet had been removed. She had escaped death again. But now they approached the village, and there she would find new dangers. Despite her life being spared, Fanny still feared death daily. Ottawa would frequently remind her that she only lived as long as he willed it. It was obvious that she was always in some danger. When the party neared the Powder River, Ottawa's brother-in-law took pity on her state and gave her fresh stockings. This moment of kindness was received as an insult to Ottawa, and soon a disagreement broke out between the warriors, with Ottawa even firing upon his brother-in-law's horse. Ottawa's brother-in-law, unable to respond in kind to the chief, turned his animosity toward Fanny. He withdrew his bow and pointed it at her chest. Immediately, a young, strong warrior appeared and grabbed the bow before it could be fired. He tossed to the ground. The young warrior, Jumping Bear, was the voice of reason, and lowered the hostilities. He himself wasn't an Oglala. He was a Blackfoot, another band of the Lakota. Jumping Bear, also translated as Charging Bear, had actually been baptized as a toddler by a Jesuit priest. This experience could have contributed to his empathy toward Fanny in that moment. From that point on in the journey, Jumping Bear looked out for Fanny, even riding with her. Since male warriors rarely rode with women, it was clear that he liked her. The warrior treated her with kindness, and it became obvious to Fanny that his interests were romantic. After 2 weeks of travel, Fanny, Jumping Bear, and the war party finally approached the Lakota Village. They stopped short in order to prepare for the festivities after their long-awaited arrival. Successful war parties often performed a kind of theater upon the return. They would stop out of sight of the village and make themselves presentable. They would adorn themselves and horses with the proper war paint and decorate themselves in both their tribal fashion and the resources they had taken from the raid. Fanny noted that the warriors wore clothes of the people in her wagon train. One warrior even wore one of their hats and a pair of Fanny's silk gloves. The only other thing he wore was a breechclout, a comical mismatch. Chief Ottawa led the party into a massive village. Fanny said that the village went on for miles, and the people danced and screamed as they made their way through the village and to the chief's lodge. Here, to her dismay, she was separated from Jumping Bear. She was alone as the war party approached the lodge of the chief. There, Ottawa's wives waited outside the tent to receive them. There were 6 wives in total. Now, apart from Jumping Bear, Fanny hoped that the women would be more sympathetic to her and maybe help her escape. She was wrong. They met the young, petite white woman with suspicious looks and crossed arms. Fanny wrote, "I had so hoped to find sympathy and pity among these women of the forest, but instead I sat cowed and trembling, scarcely daring to breathe." Ottawa entered the tent, displaying the treasures that he had taken for them. The wives immediately fought over the materials and clothes. The eldest wife pulled a knife and declared that she would decide who received what, and threatened to kill anyone who disagreed. Ottawa watched, amused, but soon left for a feast. Fanny distanced herself from the other women. Standing apart, Fanny soon noticed that many of the other women and children of the tribe came to the chief's tent. She felt that they were there to gawk at her. Captives were clearly a novelty in the village. What struck Fanny was that many of the children were fair-skinned. Recognizing Fanny's confusion, one wife who knew some English explained to Fanny that the children were offspring of what she called fort marriages. Many of the Indian women would hang around places like Fort Laramie in order to receive rations and other goods from the soldiers in exchange for companionship. Such unions resulted in pale children who were teased and harassed by the full-blooded Indians. Soldiers would often take these fort wives until their legal white wife arrived at the fort, at which point native women would be abandoned. Judging from the amount of children and toddlers who appeared half-white, it was an unnerving commonality amongst the village. As the days passed, these wives and much of the village became more accustomed to Fanny. They were often kind. They would bring her food. Others even dressed her wounds. Eventually, Ottawa presented her with an Indian child named Yellowbird. She was told that Yellowbird was now her daughter. It was difficult to understand Ottawa. He didn't speak but a few words of English, but he told Fanny that Yellowbird was given to her to replace the one that she had lost. She was only a stark reminder of Mary, and thoughts of the child prohibited the little sleep she was already getting. Fanny desperately wanted to be reunited with her, and prayed constantly that she was safe. She replayed the final moments of her in her mind, when she placed the shawl around her, and brushed her hands through her fair hair, before lowering her from that horse and into the darkness. Still, Yellowbird approached Fanny with trust, and Fanny did her best to act the role of a caring mother for the little girl. Recognizing Fanny's efforts, the elder wife kindly shared tea with Fanny to help her sleep. Despite her temper, she had become protective of Fanny. Fanny and Yellowbird curled up in the tent, and she said that she got her first good night's sleep since she had been taken. She would need the rest. Her time at peace with the Lakota was coming to the end. They were about to go to war with the United States. In late July, Fanny attended a feast. She was placed at an elevated position. The warriors watched her, and she noticed. Scalps often hung on the warriors' belts, but here they were hung on poles around her, as she listened to speeches that she couldn't understand. But as Lakota chanted and danced into the night, it became clear that the tribe was about to go to war. The following morning, Fanny awoke to a village already on the move. Warriors prepared for battle against General Alfred Sully, who had been pursuing the Lakota. The elderly, women, and children prepared the village to move before leaving for a safe location. Tent poles were lowered, and the skins used for covers and bedding were rolled up. Materials were loaded onto horses and added to travois to be dragged by dogs. Fanny joined the other women and children on horseback. 3 days later, the men returned in celebration, displaying many scalps. She didn't know what had happened, but it was clear that the Lakota got the better of the fighting. Perhaps mockingly, Fanny was painted and made to hold the staff carrying their trophies. According to Fanny, the warriors jumped around in a circle, brandishing their weapons and whooping and yelling the war cry in the most frightful manner. All jumped upon both feet at the same time, with simultaneous stamping and motions with their weapons, keeping exact time. Their gestures impressed me, as if they were actually cutting and carving each other to pieces, as they uttered their fearful, sharp yells. Fanny said that they seemed to her demonic, but she understood better than she had before. She learned why the Lakota hated the whites. The women and fort wives had their own reasons. Their pale children were harassed and teased by the full-blooded Indians, but the rest had reason as well. The whites had changed their territory and made demands from them. Wagons, like the ones Fanny rode out in, created countless trails through their country with no honest permission. The whites cut the forests and killed the buffalo. They were hostile to the Lakota and demanded to be governed by white laws. The Lakota wanted to live free on their land, as their fathers before them, but felt increasing pressure from American Western migration. Many took annuities and rations when they could. However, they were often punished by the acts of tribes outside of their own band. In retribution, they would kill and harass who they could. Fanny was beginning to see why they were so defensive of their land. It was full of herds of buffalo and elk. The land provided all that was needed and was vast and beautiful. Still, to her, the Lakota were savages and murderers. They were her captors. She prayed for freedom and escape. This time, the Lakota War Party had been successful, but she hoped that they wouldn't always be. On August 8th, the Lakota took to the warpath again, but this time they were not the hunters. In retaliation for their last encounter, General Sully hunted them. The force was overwhelming now, and he had artillery. The village retreated from Sully's forces as quickly as it could, moving until sundown when they reached the Missouri River. Dehydrated and sunburned, Fanny prayed that the soldiers would catch up and free her. She didn't even know why they were attacking, but she prayed that they had found Mary and knew she was alive. Fanny hoped just to see the soldiers that were pursuing, to know how close they were. Maybe she could flee to them, but she was forbidden to even turn around during the retreat. The next day, wounded warriors were brought into camp. Fanny was forced to dress their wounds. She, surprisingly, turned out to be quite good at it. The tribe continued to flee into the Badlands, a desolate territory. They hoped that General Sully wouldn't follow them there. But this route did little to slow Sully. As he would later say, he was determined to give them one of the most severe punishments that the Indians had ever received. The tribe moved faster and began abandoning supplies, including lodges, clothes, tools, blankets, and anything that they could to lighten their load. They even beat the exhausted horses to continue. They crossed the Yellowstone River to finally escape the pursuit. When the warriors later went to collect their abandoned supplies, they found that Sully had burned everything. Hungry and tired, Fanny's hope at rescue had faded. If General Sully's men knew she was alive, she had no way to know it. To make matters worse, the tribe had been humiliated, and their morale was terrible. The warriors who had been fighting returned from the battle, and the whole tribe mourned the dead. In response to their grief, Fanny wrote how the warriors, quote, inflicted gashes an inch in length on their bodies and limbs. Some cut off their hair, blackened their faces, and marched through the village in procession, wailing and torturing their bodies, end quote. Their rage and frustration caused many in the tribe to turn to Fanny. The chiefs, including Ottawa, brought her to council. There, in the middle of a circle, a stake had been placed on the ground and surrounded with sticks and kindling. Passing the pipe, some of the chiefs declared that the only justice that they could inflict would be to kill all of the whites. For their losses against Sully, the Lakota were debating whether or not to burn Fanny alive. But Ottawa wasn't with the other chiefs. He stood and spoke. He said that vengeance was their right, but that Fanny, since her capture, had been kind to them. She was innocent, and that their children love her as a sister, and she should not be punished for the sins of her people. His rhetoric appeased the chiefs, who abandoned the plan to burn Fanny, and while she could breathe a sigh of relief while leaving the council, things were about to get worse for her. For the next few weeks, there was no food. They had abandoned it all when Sully's forces were chasing them. Dogs and horses starved to death. Their skinny, malnourished bodies were eaten, but there wasn't much to go around. The tribe constantly moved searching for game, but in the Badlands they rarely found any. Fanny was hungry all of the time. She was often denied what little food was available. Resorting to eating grass, she struggled to complete her required chores. Famine impacted everyone in the tribe and caused Ottawa's elder wife, who had once been kind, to grow impatient and more aggressive. Another Indian woman took pity on Fanny. She had lost a lot of weight. The woman pulled Fanny into her tent and shared meat from her husband's recent deer hunt. The elder wife witnessed this, and rage fueled by jealousy and hunger caused her to draw her knife and vow to kill Fanny. Fanny ran from the old woman, fearing for her life, and found Ottawa. He tried to intervene, but the elder wife's rage could not be contained. When he placed himself in front of Fanny, the elder wife stabbed him several times. Another Indian saw the commotion, took out his revolver, and fired a group of shots at Fanny. Logically, he assumed the white woman must have been the cause of the problems. The shots missed her, but a bullet was lodged in Ottawa's arm. Fanny ran to escape, but the warriors quickly ran her down. She expected persecution, but was surprised to be brought to the tent of Ottawa. He was bleeding badly and severely injured from the stabs and gunshot wound. She was left to dress his wounds. She never saw the elder wife again, and didn't ask what happened to her. For the next few weeks, Fanny's primary role was to tend to Ottawa. The blood loss and bullet had severely weakened the chief, but even in his state, he worked to strengthen the Lakota. They were not strong enough to fight General Sully. Ottawa hoped to unite with another band. He wanted to marry the daughter of a chief. The union, he hoped, would strengthen his tribe against Sully. Having lost nearly all of their supplies, he looked to Fanny. He took her shoes as a gift for his new bride. They were accepted. It must have been strange for Fanny to watch her former things, taken from the raid, be exchanged as trophies among her captors. But Indians kept trophies. Many unfamiliar faces joined Ottawa's band as a result of the new union. One was especially horrible. While on the move in the Badlands, a warrior she didn't know rode up beside her. He didn't say anything, but she noticed at the warrior's side there was a little shawl. The one from the day that she was captured. The shawl that she had wrapped Mary in before lowering her from the horse. Next to the shawl was suspended a small scalp with fair hair. Fanny dropped to the ground as if she was dead. She later wrote, "My eyes rested on the frightful sight. I trembled in my saddle and grasped the air for support. A blood-red cloud seemed to come between me and the outer world." Fanny now understood why Yellowbird was given to her, and what Ottawa meant when he told her she was to replace the one that she had lost. As she lay on the ground, the Indians tried to get her to move. Fanny begged them to kill her. They didn't, and left her there. Fanny wrote that it was a long time before she felt normal. After weeks of despair, an Indian named Porcupine rode into the village. He was well-dressed and rode a nice horse. Fanny noticed him immediately, but he didn't talk to her right away. After a few days, he approached her and gave her a letter from a Captain Marshall of the 11th Cavalry. The letter detailed that the military knew she was alive, and that they had made several attempts to rescue her. They had sent Porcupine, a friendly Indian, to bring her back, and that he was rewarded with provisions for the delivery. They included his clothes and horse. Additionally, the letter said that Porcupine could be trusted, since the fort had his 3 wives, as well as other hostages. But after Porcupine delivered the letter, he told her that he wasn't going to take her back. He would join Lakota in their fight against the whites. Fanny pleaded with him to fulfill his promise. She begged and asked about his wives and the hostages. He laughed and told her, "The white soldiers are cowards. They never kill women. I will deceive them as I have done before." Porcupine said that he would simply tell them that she had died. With that, Fanny had little hope that she would ever leave the Lakota. And so she lived on with them, starved and enslaved, with the same people who murdered her adopted daughter, not knowing what happened to her husband, and with no credible chance to escape. Her only solace was now knowing that people were looking for her. For the next few weeks, the Lakota stayed in the Badlands. Fanny barely escaped a prairie fire, and her relationship with Ottawa's newest wife was testy. One day, after Fanny had been with the Lakota for 5 months, a band of Blackfoot Lakota came into Ottawa's Oglala camp. They had come to bargain for Fanny. The American military refused local Indians winter supplies because they knew they were holding a white woman. They wanted her returned to Fort Sully. A council between the 2 groups lasted 2 days. Ottawa didn't want to give Fanny up, but the Blackfoot were insistent. Eventually, they came to a compromise, one that they both agreed upon. An opportunity for revenge. They would use Fanny as bait. The Blackfoot would take her to the fort as her rescuers, but once inside, they would slaughter the soldiers and return Fanny to Ottawa. The thought of being used this way horrified her. She wanted nothing more to be reunited with her people, but didn't want more of them to die. The Blackfoot left 3 horses with Ottawa, as generous collateral for her return after they fulfilled their plan. Among 50 armed and painted warriors, they traveled 150 miles to the Blackfoot camp. It was exhausting and cold, but when Fanny arrived, she was met with a celebration. The chief's wife told her that she would be safe at camp, and that any mistreatment against her would be met with harsh punishment, which was good, because Fanny would have many visitors. The Blackfoot were not the only ones incentivized by the U.S. to return their captives. Other groups hoped to pick up rations to help them survive the upcoming winter. The Yanktons were the first to visit the Blackfoot with desires to purchase Fanny. The Blackfoot chief said no. After several other bands made similar offers, the Blackfoot began hiding her. One night, an Indian even cut into her tent in an attempt to kidnap her. She had quickly become a valuable commodity. Poor weather, including snowdrifts, delayed the Blackfoot mission. But as they waited, an old protector, Jumping Bear, appeared in the Blackfoot Village. He too had heard of their possession of Fanny. He had been gone for some time, but it was immediately clear that his affection for Fanny had not changed. He confessed his love for her. She saw an opportunity. She thought that this might be the only person truly willing to help her. Fanny asked Jumping Bear to prove his love by carrying a letter to her people at the fort and delivering it personally to General Sully. She promised that if he did that, Jumping Bear would be rewarded. He was reluctant, but Fanny assured him that the letter would not harm his people and that he was written about very kindly. Fanny told him that the army would give him a fast horse so that he could return, and told him to go prove his friendship and come back with his prizes. Jumping Bear finally agreed and took the letter, but within a couple days after he left, the snow had cleared enough that the Blackfoot were ready to move. The letter warned the general of the surprise attack that was planned, and it begged the warriors to rescue her. As the fort drew near, their ambush imminent, she could only hope that before they got there, Jumping Bear had delivered the message. The Indians left for Fort Sully in early December 1864. The trip was 200 miles in the freezing cold. Fanny, malnourished and weak, knew that one of 2 outcomes was possible. Either the Lakota would slaughter the soldiers in the fort, or Jumping Bear was able to deliver her message and she would be saved. After making the long journey, they arrived, prepared for war on December 11th. After all of these months, Fanny had grown capable of understanding the Lakota language. She recalls the speech the chief gave to his warriors. From the best of her recollection, quote, "Friends and sons, listen to my words. You are a great and powerful band of our people. The inferior race, who have encroached on our rights and territories, justly deserve hatred and destruction. These intruders came among us, and we took them by the hand. We believed them to be friends and true speakers. They have shown us how false and cruel they can be. They build forts to live in and shoot from their big guns. Our people fall before them. Our game is chased from the hills. Our women are taken from us, or won to forsake our lodges, and wronged and deceived. Meet them with equal cunning. Show them no mercy. They are but few. We are many. Whet your knives and string your bows. Sharpen the tomahawk and load the rifle." End quote. His warriors grunted with approval and made their war preparations. The next day, 8 chiefs rode in advance, leading Fanny's horse. It would have been an imposing sight. Fanny was dressed in a white cotton gown, and a buffalo robe for warmth was placed across her shoulders. As Fanny approached, she could see soldiers manning their garrisons. The snow on the ground absorbed the noise, and the entire scene felt silent. Was she about to be saved, or would everyone be killed? Was this about to be over, or was it just another disaster? The war party held back as the chiefs proceeded with Fanny. The gate at Fort Sully opened, just enough to allow one of the captains, several officers, and an interpreter to exit. The captain approached Fanny among the chiefs. "Am I free? Indeed free?" she asked. The captain whispered back, "Yes." They welcomed Fanny and her accompanying chiefs into the fort, and, of course, the reward awaiting them and all of their brave warriors. At this, the rest of the distant war party moved their horses forward to enter the gates. But once the chiefs were inside, the pleasantries of the soldiers faded, and they threw off their masks the same way the Lakota had done at the Wagon train attack several months earlier. A loud voice boomed, ordering the gates closed and the men to man the high walls of the fort. The rest of the Blackfeet war party was shut out just as they came within range. Their chiefs, now hostages. At that moment, Fanny knew that Jumping Bear had delivered her letter, and that after nearly 7 months, she was finally free. Shortly after her rescue, Fanny was reunited with her husband, who had not stopped his search for her. Unfortunately, Josiah died of cholera a few years later, but not before they had a son, Josiah Jr. In 1870, President Grant and Congress awarded Fanny $5,000 as compensation for her losses to the Indians and her assistance in preventing the raid on the fort. Fanny eventually crossed paths with Sarah Larimore, who too had survived the ordeal. The pair of women agreed to co-author a book detailing their survival among the Lakota, but Fanny would come to discover that Sarah planned to steal Fanny's work and publish it herself. This led to a plagiarism lawsuit between the two women. Fanny won the trial and was awarded a small sum of money. This story is largely adapted from her own published version, My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians, which came out a few years after she was saved. Fanny lived a long life after her time with the Lakota. She even reconnected with Jumping Bear in Washington, D.C. a decade or so later. He was married and hilariously introduced his wife to Fanny as Kola Mitawa, or my friend. Like the rest of his tribe, he was forced to assimilate, but tried to use his position for good, advocating for the rights of his people while embracing his new country. Fanny Kelly died in 1904, never forgetting the sacrifice of her young adopted daughter. But she was one of the few to survive being kidnapped by the Lakota. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to leave a like, comment, or to subscribe, and take a look at the next one.